Hey everyone, my guest today is Rafid Fadul. Rafid is going to introduce himself in the beginning of this interview. We got together today because Rafid went to Costa Rica to be part of the Reverse Longevity documentary by Charles Maddox. I actually already had a podcast with Charles and he referred me to talk to Rafid. Rafid is the Chief Medical Advisor at Cenegenics and the co-founder and CEO of Zivian Health. Today, we went into discussion about radical longevity, radical life extension, and his view on that, and about his general learnings in the field of longevity and his experience. So without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Rafid Fadul. Hey Rafid, how about we start by you giving us a 5-minute summary of who you are and what you're currently working on.
I'm Rafid Fadul. I'm a pulmonary critical care physician by training, by way of Georgetown University and then Cleveland Clinic. Right now I work in the health tech space, and I'm also the chief medical advisor for a company called Cenegenics, which has been around for 27 years at this point, as one of the leaders in performance health and longevity medicine. I've joined the company about 3 years ago, and this has really become my clinical passion. The nickel story about how I ended up here is really started from doing critical care and working in the intensive care units. And really just having like both intellectual frustration and emotional frustration, managing patients at these late stages of disease. And really, maybe I buy them another day, month, maybe a year. But, that was the best case scenario in most of the patients that we see in the intensive care unit. And the reason is because most of the damage has already been done. So I'm putting out like a small fire when the big fire has already ripped through the house, right? So, and that really, it takes a toll on you, on your soul. and also, intellectually, it's very frustrating because you want to solve these problems. And if you had a chance to go, all you needed was time. And so if you had a chance to go back in time and intervene on those problems, very early or even before they manifested, right? Preventing them from taking place, the need for people like me in intensive care would be dramatically less. So right now in the United States, we have a huge staffing problem, right? Where we have an aging population, and we also have the number of people going into critical care is going down. And then you also have a generally sicker population. So we have much more comorbidities. Everyone's aware that America is like one of the most obese nations in the world, if not the most obese. And along with that comes a lot of other metabolic illnesses that we are struggling to address. And so that really was what got me on the path of saying, okay, well, we can do better than this as a society. We can do better than this. And so looking further upstream and saying, how can we focus on preventive medicine and focusing on stopping disease before it starts, and that just the natural byproduct and consequence of that is improved lifespan and health span. So that's kind of how I got into longevity. That's how I fell in with Cenegenics, and that's what my clinical focus of interest is these days.
Can you tell us a bit about Cenegenics? Like, what exactly do you do there, and what is the mission?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, Cenegenics started 27 years ago. They're really the pioneers in hormone replacement therapy as a therapeutic for purposes of longevity and performance health. And at the time, I openly say this, at the time, the data wasn't really there. And the general medical community was kind of, poo-pooing it, right? And they were frowning on it. And then eventually the data caught up, and it proves that there was actually a lot of merit to what they were saying and thinking and doing at those years and years before the data really caught up to it. But they had good signal, and they acted on it like true pioneers. So they, at an early, because they were there, one of the first, if not the first, players in the space of longevity and wellness. They became a medical authority, and there was a lot of transition in the company over 27 years, as you can imagine. And a few years ago, there was new leadership, and there was a new emphasis on really holistic care. Certainly, HRT remains a part of that, one of the tools in our armamentarium. But we're taking a broader look at longevity as a whole, performance medicine, and thinking really granularly and about health span, lifespan, and applying it on an individual basis.
Yeah, yeah. You're also the co-founder and CEO of Zivian Health. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So Zivian Health is a health tech company that, again, is kind of solving the problem in a different way, right? So I mentioned earlier that we have these staffing considerations in the U.S. Because of population growth and because we have already dwindling population of physicians and an evolving workforce. And so, one of the things that I realized early on in my career is that there are two patients that I can take care of at any given time. One is the patient that's right in front of me, right? And that's, I think about that when I think about like really investing in that person and preventive medicine and whether in the ICU, whatever it is, like all those things, it's that person in front of me. And the second patient is actually the system, right? So our system is broken. The U.S. healthcare system, I barely can even call it a healthcare system, right? So it's fundamentally flawed in unfortunately a lot of different ways. And what Zivian Health does, it tries to solve some of those problems that are plaguing it on the staffing side. So I can tell you that from being a physician that was out there on the front lines during COVID, and we saw a lot of what people call burnout. I gently disagree with that term. I think actually the more apt term is moral injury, but neither here nor there. Point is, we saw a lot of people working at the top of their license, and a lot of people burning out, or just somehow saying, I don't want to continue this. This is taking too much of an emotional toll, physical toll, etc. And we're now left with this evolving workforce that we need to level up as across the board, right? So when we think about, when I think about kind of the work that I do, it's really kind of bifurcated, right? So it's work for the individual and work for the system as a whole. And Zivian Health tackles that system as a whole, and Cenegenics tackles the individual.
Can you explain how do you tackle that problem as a whole? Like, because it seems like how do you tackle the evolving workforce?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, as I mentioned, physicians are dwindling. So that means that what's happening is that people are working at the top of their license in other capacities. So, for example, there's a lot of nurse practitioners, physician assistants, respiratory therapists, pharmacists, nurses, all of whom actually work on our platform. But the level of training for each of them is quite different, right? So, and the example I give people is, you can imagine, like in a wartime scenario, you bring up all your soldiers, but when you run out of soldiers, you bring up, the farmers, and you bring up, the butchers and whomever else you can. And they're not really trained for war, but you have to figure out how to get them upskilled and get them ready to go. Right. And that's the situation that we're in right now in the US healthcare system, is that we actually have a silent war on our hands against poor health, and we don't have enough troops on the field. And so, and the troops that we have, and many times through no fault of their own, are being asked to perform tasks they're not necessarily trained for, right? So that's where Zivian comes in. We help companies navigate this labyrinth of compliance that exists. So I'm not sure how familiar you are. Luckily, you're in Germany, which has an amazing system. But the U.S. on a state-by-state basis has very complex rules that regulate who can practice, how they can practice, et cetera, based on their geography, based on their specialty, based on their like category of workforce. All those things, they make it really difficult to scale a workforce naturally. So if you're a company that wants to have a solution that covers all 50 states, it's almost impossible to figure out how to do that and stay compliant, and then also manage quality at the same time. So we started out focusing on compliance first, and we solved that for our partners. And then once we've unlocked that bottleneck, the next bottleneck that we had to address was quality, right? So again, think back to that analogy I just gave you about bringing up anyone you can during wartime. So we need to figure out a way to get those people up and ready and upskilled and ready for the fight. Again, the fight against poor health across the nation as quickly as possible, and doing it in a way that's always kind of patient centric, always thinking about the person in front of you. In our case, they're an invisible stakeholder. They don't have a role on our platform, but the whole platform is built for them, right? So it's built for that patient.
Okay. Going a bit more general, what person, discovery, or idea in the longevity space gets less attention than it deserves?
I think a lot of discoveries get less attention, and I think the reason why is because the really sexy things, right, are the ones that make really good sound bites. They're the ones that make economic opportunities for people who choose to pursue them, and I think those are the ones that people look for frankly for like miracle fixes, right? So, and I could give you 10 examples just right now. I mean, GLP-1s are touted as now this miracle drug. And plasmapheresis is another one that's recently caught attention. Rapamycin, there's a lot of medications that have come up and they have interesting data. Some of them, actually the data has, as time goes on, the data is less and less compelling, right? But they still get more airtime than the very proven methods, right? So I think when I think about longevity, whether you're talking about lifespan or health span, the fundamentals have remained the same in my mind since the very beginning, and those are free, right? So
sleep well, eat well, move,
move around, sleep well, eat well, and have some mental peace, right? Like if you do that, you're already 98% of the way there, right? Add rapamycin, great. add TPE, great. But you've already done 98% of the work if you're focusing on those pillars, right? So, and then I think that falls to the wayside. So you ask me like, what doesn't get the airtime? It's that stuff, right? Because that takes persistence, diligence, continual effort, and it's not something you can monetize, generally speaking.
Doesn't sound
right.
sexy.
So I don't think it gets a lot of airtime. I think the things that are sexy new ideas, right? Like, TPE, let's do, whatever, like you name it, right? Like there's always like a new thing coming out. Some of those actually have some data behind them, but some of them don't. Or some of them have just like very limited, like animal data. And, and this is something that plagues our space of longevity in general, is that it's not the same as kind of some of the other disciplines in medicine where you can have these, double-blinded, randomized controlled trials of very large N populations, and you can really come up with like very definitive statements about the utility of one intervention or the other. This is not where we are in longevity, and structurally, I think we will never be there, right? Which is okay, right? We can still make inferences based on good data, but the devil's in the details, right? How we evaluate that data and how we incorporate it into our practice.
I mean, like, I kind of understand why those compounds get like more attention than this classic, like, okay, which supplement to take, and then not which supplement to take, but like which, like, work out, sleep well, and whatever, because like sleeping well will not lead to radical life extension. Like eating well will like maybe buy you a couple of years, but not like significantly like make a crazy change in many orders of magnitudes. I guess that what I wanted to ask you is like, what is your stance on like radical life extension?
So I mean, I disagree with you. I think like you said,
yes.
you said nutrition like won't lead to radical life extension. I can tell you. I mean, depending on how you define radical life extension, I can tell you without a doubt, I have taken care of patients who eat like shit and they're dead before 60. I can tell you right now without a fact.
Okay. No, that's. I guess I'm more talking about like radical longevity. So like the search for. Okay, I know people have like different stances. I don't know if you're like familiar with like vitalism or like some of those movements that like are going for trying to essentially end death permanently. And I think more that was my question. So what is your stance on those kind of movement? What's your stance on radical life extension in the sense of living for 500, 1,000 years?
I think my general feeling on that is that we're missing the boat philosophically, right? So what is the point of just take a step back, like what is the point of longevity in the first place? Like why do we want the party not to stop, right? Is because like I think we can distill that back
That's
down to
amazing.
like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So, we think about like the basic physiologic needs, and then we think about like, safety, security, all these things, relationships, and then it goes up further. Like that's typically where we most of us stop at like the second or third rung, right? Like, we have a job, maybe we have good relationships, etc. And then we think about like the last two, which no one really talks about so much, is just like, purpose and self-actualization, right? And in my mind, when I think about this a lot, I think about why are we obsessed with like never letting the party end, right? And the answer probably is that like we are searching for those last two things, right? So it's less to me in my mind about saying like, I understand the allure of saying, oh, what if we just never die? But I'm not sure that's necessarily, first of all, I'm not sure that's desirable. Second of all, I think that, the question is like, why are you even asking that question in the first place? Right. And what are you missing? What do you need more time to do to get out of life? So I think philosophically, like, I think we're kind of going off the mark, in my opinion, when we think about like vitalism, these other schools of thought. That to me is not really like the main driver of what's going to be meaningful in longevity in the space as a whole. And I think, but this is purely a philosophical question in my mind, right? Like before you even go down that road, the question is like, why are we doing this, right? And the answer really is like fulfillment, right? Like once you, I'll pose to you a question a different way. Yes, if I could tell you by 70 years old, you will live the most fulfilled life, right? And then you die, versus you can extend your life to 150 without fulfillment. What would you choose?
No, it's definitely 70, like no question.
Right. So so the question in my mind around like, why are we pushing the boundaries to get to, 500, 1,000, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't cancel each other out. Like just because you live 500 years doesn't mean that you can't be fulfilled. Like I think
Agreed.
life is so amazing.
Agreed.
Why don't you have more of it? Like
I agree, and so I don't think it's like a binary situation where they're mutually exclusive. It's one or the other. That's not the case. But if I've got time to focus on one thing, right, and to focus on, especially in the subject of longevity, which there's a million avenues that you can go just in longevity. This space, more so than any other in medicine, is evolving rapidly. When there's tons of data coming out, which makes it the most intellectually exciting space, in my opinion, to be in right now. So with all that being said, if I have to choose where I'm going to devote my efforts, the answer is pretty clear, right? Like I would like to do both. I would love to live to be at least 100 and have a super fulfilled life up to 100 or longer, right? Like that's the goal. But the idea of saying like, let's only focus on this extreme of how do I never die, right? Like that to me, you're missing the boat, right? Like that's where the pendulum is swinging too far in the wrong direction. So I think like, look, we should continue to push the boundaries in that regard as well. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but the primary goal of living is like to be fulfilled in life, right? So, to extend the duration of that time, absolutely great. But the primary goal is fulfillment.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I think I get you. Like it's you say more that we can do that, but we shouldn't forget that like the main thing isn't actually living for however long. The main thing is actually like that you are happy, that you're fulfilled, and if that is not given, like there's no point in whatever. I see that. I see that.
I'll give you another example. I'll give you another example, and I won't say the names obviously, but I had a patient, a very wealthy man, who was my patient at the hospital, who was basically long since mentally checked out, but we kept him alive for literally years, right? And every day when I would take care of him, we would rotate through and who covered him that month. Every day I would wonder, what the fuck were we doing? Like, why were we doing this to this man? I didn't understand it. And, like we were extending his life, but to what end? Like this guy was not engaged with the surroundings, and I'm not sure that we were doing him any favors, so that having been very literally extending someone's life, I can tell you that, the idea of pushing the numbers, it's just a number, right? That's not where the value is. The value comes from engagement, fulfillment, and, and self-actualization. Like that's where that's the purpose of life. That's why we do all of this, right? So,
Yes.
and that to me is much more worthy of focus and thought than saying like, what kind of biohacks can we do to, push my age from 2 digits to 3 digits to 4 digits even. Like that's completely secondary. And again, you're talking to someone who has done this for patients, right?
Yes.
Like I've
Yes.
seen it in real time. This isn't theoretical for me, right? And so, and again, it's not that it wasn't to extreme numbers. We're talking about like extending someone who essentially was dead, but using technology to, extend their life by 4 years. I don't think we did that man any favors.
Yeah, I see that. Like for me, like personally, I would say I would love radical life extension, but this has to be given that that I'm healthy, that I'm able to do something I'm passionate about, that I'm happy, that I'm fulfilled. Because if not, like, what do I do this for? Like, I don't want to be like laying in a bed, being half dead for like I said, like 1,000 years. Like,
Exactly.
what for? Like, then like,
Yeah.
but if I can be healthy, then I take 1,000 years. Why not? Like,
Yeah.
because life is amazing. But that's
No, look,
part of the point.
I
Yeah,
agree with you. I agree with
yeah,
you. And that, but I will also say that opens a whole host of other philosophical questions, right? And so
yeah. I
I
know,
think
I
it's,
know.
yeah, like we're solving biological problems, but we're not solving, philosophical problems, or maybe perhaps we're creating philosophical problems. So I hear you, but I think a lot of people who are in the space of radical longevity right now, and I say this with respect, like philosophically, I love the idea, right? But I think we're missing the mark, and they've not been on the other end of the spectrum dealing with these things on a very real, visceral basis. Many of the folks who are in the space now, I mean, this is both a good and a bad thing about longevity right now, is that it's like the new sexy thing. Everyone wants to talk about it, right? Like longevity in and of itself is now a buzzword, right? So it's drawing a lot of attention, which is great because now comes research dollars, now comes scholars, now comes intellects, but now also comes people who are maybe well intentioned but are not like the best people to be pushing the agendas, right? And then you have other people who maybe are just charlatans, right? Like, and that
Yes.
we have that in our space. So it's a double edged sword now. The popularity that longevity is getting, which so just us as practitioners and also us as consumers have to be thoughtful around the whole thing, really in a holistic fashion, to understand exactly what are we chasing.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. Like, if there's actually somebody that says it's just about living longer, like just like I think everybody. I don't. A lot of people, when I talk to them about this, they're like, "Yes, I don't want to be sick for super long." But like, I don't know if there's anybody in this world that would be like, "Yes, I want to be sick for 500 years. I want to increase my but my lifespan, but not my health span." I don't know. Like people always say, like, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. Like you shouldn't work. Like this is bad. This is bad." But I don't know. I never found anybody that was arguing for I want maximum lifespan and I don't care for my health span. I think everybody's like, I want the health
Yeah,
span.
I agree
Yeah.
with you, and I don't think the issue is between lifespan and health span, right? Like everyone wants to live long and live well. Like I think that's a given, right? I think the issue is what are we defining as like living well, right? Like you just defined it as health span, right? And that's I think that's what most people do. What I'm saying is that you're missing the point of, or like not you personally,
You're
but
right.
like when we talk about this, the point of, okay, yes, I want my chronologic age to be extended as long as it can be. I want to be physically in the condition that I can actually enjoy life. But
Yes.
the why is the piece that no one talks about, or at least not enough, frankly. And this is the piece where I talk about like purpose, self-actualization, philosophical values. Like this is the piece that's really missing in a lot of the conversations that I hear. And we can say that we care about it, right? Like everyone will say they care about it, but like the reality is, I mean, all we've talked about is like health span, lifespan, right? Like that's the only things
Yeah.
that we've focused our attention on this conversation. So like, where do we, in general, like my position is, yeah, like no one's going to say, oh, the philosophy and the purpose doesn't matter. Nobody will ever say that. They're all going to say, of course it matters. But in practical terms, how much actual time and thought do they give to it? Very little, right? They're focused on like the edge of science, and they're focused on longevity and in both capacities, chronologically improving age, and also from a health span standpoint. So I think that there's this third leg here, right? Like we talk about lifespan, health span. There's this third leg that, I haven't come up with a cool name for it. Maybe I will after this conversation. But thinking about like the purpose and the why, that also needs to
Fulfillment.
be,
Yeah.
that the fulfillment component is huge.
I agree that it's huge, but it's a whole different set of thoughts you have to go through for that. Like it's very different from like the science part. Like, okay, how do we extend human health span or lifespan? It's also way more individual. I don't think that you can really like. We can figure out at some point maybe medicine to increase human health span, but like the why, I'm not sure if we can give that to people. Like that is for people themselves to figure out.
Look, I'm not sure everyone has the same why.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I'm not advocating that they
definitely
do,
not.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like that's not what I'm saying. But I actually don't think the science of it is that far off from the ethics and the morality of it and the philosophy of it, right? And again, like, so I did a lot of transplant before this. You want to talk about like ethical issues? That is a bucket of ethical issues, right? Like the idea of especially when you're talking about like lung transplant, where there's limited resources. Like in the United States, the list for those who need transplants is in the tens of thousands, and we only do 2,000 transplants per year, right? Thereabouts, like give or take 100 or so, right? So the ethical considerations of this, and not just in lung transplant, but really for any solid organ, like we talk about this all the time, right? Like, should people be allowed to sell their kidneys, right? We would never do that in the U.S., but that's actually that's a conversation, because you're essentially denying someone who's poor in another, maybe in a third world country, the ability to make a life-changing amount of money to sell an organ that they can actually live with one kidney, right? So like we were applying our ethics to this, and I have no position on this, by the way. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. That's not what I'm getting at. But what I'm suggesting though is that there's a conversation. The conversation around ethics should always exist around the conversations around science, right? So the idea that we can only do one and not do the other, of course they're different, but they're necessary. Like they have to go in tandem, right? So I don't think if we're going to have the conversations around, and this is the part that I feel is always missing, if you're having these conversations around vitalism and how do we extend radical longevity, you must at the same time have these conversations around ethical implications, philosophical implications, and moral implications of it. Like you can't do it on its own, and it doesn't. It should not exist in a vacuum. And there's a wealth of data from other disciplines of medicine where we've done this, right? Like where we've failed. By the way, we have failed to think about the ethical implications or philosophical implications of decision making from science. And oftentimes, by the way, this is typical. The science moves faster than everything else. Right.
Yeah.
And so
philosophy has to catch up.
Exactly. And so knowing that that's the case, knowing that the science always leads, we have to be extra diligent in focusing on thinking about these other things like the ethical implications, moral implications, philosophical implications, right? Like we can't just let the science go by itself. And you're talking to a guy I'm a science guy. I'm a triple boarded physician, right? So like I of anyone, I should be the one who's saying like, oh, let's push the science as far as we can. But I've seen what happens when we don't do that, or when we don't incorporate these other aspects.
I prepared a bunch of other questions about your experience, but I want to stay on this for like one more.
Yeah.
So you say the ethical implications. What do you think might be the ethical the ethical problems of radical life extension?
I mean, just play it out to its logical end, right? Now you have people continuing to be born. And you have a life extension of what? Let's call it 1,000. Like pick an age, whatever.
Yes.
But you still have the same one planet with same limited resources, right?
That's The question is if that's the case, but
yeah. I mean, like that's also up for debate, right? But
yes.
But theoretically, that's an issue. So then, who gets access to radical longevity, right? Yeah. Then you have like an equity issue. Right. So like there's a lot of these things that we haven't contemplated. Right.
Yeah.
I only initially talk about it from the philosophical sense of like, well, what is the purpose of extension in the first place? It's fulfillment. But there's also ethical implications that need to be considered as well as you continue to push the boundaries.
Yeah, I think there you go into territory. There are a lot of people that say like, technology is going to save everything. Like we're just going to build space stations and whatever. And that might be true. But I agree with you that we have to carefully consider that.
Yeah, it's just,
Still, I
I mean,
believe,
look, I would
yeah,
love to,
yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah,
just, it's not an easy answer, right? And
yeah,
I sure as hell don't have the answers, right? I just
yeah,
know these are the questions that we should be asking, right? And like
yeah.
people a lot smarter than me need to be involved in this process as well, thinking about these things, routinely, and like waking up thinking about, going to sleep thinking about them. That's how we move society forward as a whole.
Okay, yeah. Now we can go to the more uh, away from the ethical issues and more to the practical side.
Sure.
Can you tell us maybe, or can you tell me, like one counterintuitive thing that you learned in your years of working in the longevity field, like one aha moment where you realized something that you didn't think before?
Counterintuitive in the context of longevity, or in my
Yeah,
medical experience altogether?
like yes, like medical and longevity, like yeah.
Yeah. There's a few things that I could pick on, but I think the one that to me is only more and more coming into my face is a lot of the efforts that I've applied in intellectually and longevity and performance health have been around the biology, the physiology, the therapeutic interventions, the things that we all talk about, right? Things that appear in all the journals, and um, whether it's like a medication or different workout regimen, versus one versus the other, or nutritional approaches, et cetera. The piece that I always neglected personally, I'm speaking from my own experience here, um, and candidly in my own personal life, let alone like professionally, was the gravity of the mental health piece, right? And how much that the mind body spirit connection is actually impactful to longevity. And we've seen some evidence of this, by the way. There's a thing called Takotsubo's cardiomyopathy, right? More commonly known as broken heart syndrome, where two loved ones, if they've been together for many, many years, if one of them dies, the other one develops this cardiomyopathy and typically dies within 6 months, right? They call it broken
Yeah.
heart syndrome. And we know that it's just from like a surge of catecholamine release that leads to this cardiomyopathy. And so when you do an autopsy on them, you actually see there's no, it's not like they have like tons of plaque that just like wasn't pathologic prior to this. It's all related to this massive stressor in their lives, right? And we know this is like a well-known, well-documented example in medical literature. But what I find interesting is that, and again, like reflecting on myself, is that I'm like, shit, I don't think about this enough with my patients. I don't talk about these levers enough with my patients, and certainly I wasn't doing it with myself. And so, I see it now, and actually we're starting to see it now with certain testings. Like I give you an example, like the glycan age test, right? So it's a biologic age test where you can actually see. I was chatting with their founder about it. You can see when people have life events like stressful divorces, their biologic age surges, right? Like they had 10 years. And so, and it can also go back down once they've kind of regained their mental and spiritual stability, right? So the measurable and dramatic impact of that, and I say measurable now because we do have tools like glycanage, for example, that can demonstrate this. The impact of these things is so profound, and we don't talk about it enough. But that's the piece that I think is top of mind for me. Like what's like counterintuitive, like, oh, we don't, I mean, like if I do, even me in the beginning of this conversation, I said, oh, if you do like the core fundamentals, right, that gets you like 90% of the way there. And I threw in mental health at the very end, but like, that wasn't like big part of our conversation, right? I mentioned it briefly. But that's the piece that I think we don't give enough airtime to, and can be like a total time bomb and just like offset all your other good efforts, right? So you can do everything else right, but if you're physically, but if you're not, your mind body spirit alignment is not there, and your mental health is suffering, then you're toast.
Well, I think that's an important thing to empathize, and actually it fits in with the thing we were talking about before with the philosophy. Like, we don't want longevity without mental health, and
right.
at the moment we can't like it's so connected like with each other. You also went to Costa Rica for the reverse longevity documentary with Charles Maddox, who I already had on the podcast. Can you maybe tell a bit about your experience, like some things that you learned, or like how this was for you?
Yeah, I had a great time. People who know me, they know that I say I like to be the dumbest guy in the room because I get to learn from everyone else, right? And I was
Yes.
definitely the dumbest guy in the room in Costa Rica. One of your other guests, Andre Meyer, was there.
Yeah.
Brilliant physician and an academic, really doing great work in the space. Nicolina Lautz, the founder of Glycanage, was there.
Yeah.
Just incredibly insightful. Honestly, it was actually really encouraging. Like participating in that documentary was great because my perspective is one of a practitioner who's doing it day in day out with my patients, and being in that room with so many thought leaders was really inspiring. And again, one of the things that plagues this idea of performance health longevity is we do get a lot of charlatans in the space now, right?
Yeah.
And so being in a room with just brilliant minds, really thoughtful and analytic about their approach was it was incredibly refreshing. Every time you're around, you have those conversations, you pick up a couple pearls, right? And so it's always very good to be in those type of dynamic, collaborative communities. And it was so nothing but great experiences there. I'm appreciative that Charles had me on the documentary.
Yeah. Oh, very nice, very nice. You were briefly talking about like your approach or your angle to longevity as a physician. Is there something in the field that you believe that other people might disagree on? Like,
yeah, I think from my standpoint, honestly, my views evolve with the data, and that's it's like the least controversial answer. Unfortunately, it's the true one. Like I've been on the metformin train, I've been on the rapamycin train, and as the data comes out, my approach refines. Like, this is the thing about our space, right? Because you can't do, aside from like, twin studies at birth and carrying it out in a hyper controlled environment, which obviously doesn't exist. It's almost impossible. Basically, it's impossible to have the same rigor and quality of studies in longevity as we do in other domains of medicine. So what that means is that we now have to rely on a lot of animal data. We have to rely on small retrospective studies. So like lower study design quality. We have to look at like molecular data and really extrapolate theories and inferences from those. And so the byproduct of that is I change my mind quite a bit, right? So like as new data comes out, I'm like, okay, well, shit, I was saying this like 6 months ago. Now I'm saying something different. And so I'm generally cautious about new trends. And I think that this is the big thing with Cenegenics is the shared decision making approach, right? So like if you were my patient, we would go over all of your biology, we would go all of your performance metrics. We would have a very deep conversation about you and what your personal goals are, what your challenges are, et cetera. And then I would share, like, my job is really just kind of like be your steward, right? I'm there to share with you all the data and give you, the physician's interpretation of that data. And then our job then from there is to make that decision about what to do together. Right. So, I'm not a big believer that like everyone should be on statins or everyone should be on this or no one should be on that. Like I have colleagues who have those views and to each their own. I'm not going to tell people how to practice. But especially in longevity, because the data is constantly in evolution, it's hard to say with definitive certainty, like we should always be doing X, Y, or Z. Like, the data is evolving, right? Like the one area where data doesn't evolve is around those fundamentals, right? But around the sexier therapeutics, right? Especially when you asked earlier about like the context of radical longevity, we're always going to get new data, and we're always going to find like some promising idea may actually be shit, and then some other idea that we thought was not so promising actually has traction, right? When applied to a larger patient population, so or a different patient population. So for me, I guess, I mean, it's not really controversial, so I don't have like a hot take, but my hot take is that I have no hot takes. Is that
Okay.
we have to be flexible, and we have to say that the burden is on us to stay up on this ever evolving body of data, right? Like, again, coolest part about longevity is that everyone is interested in it, and new data comes out every single day. So it's a heavy burden on the physicians to really like stay on top of it, interpret it, and share that with your patients. So, but you also have to be willing to say, like, yeah, I was wrong about this 6 months ago. Like, I have a few colleagues that were really into telomere testing several years ago, and then they were like, oh, that was totally not a thing. Like we should not have done that, right? So, but it was well intentioned and it was a good idea at the time. So they were making the best decision they could with the data they had at that juncture. So certainly it's easy to in hindsight to poke holes. So that that's not what we're doing here. But I think the hot take is don't have any hot takes. Just be flexible and be on top of the data. It's not a sexy answer, but that's the best answer.
I think I actually I formulated it a bit wrong. I didn't want to poke you to give like the most controversial thing. It was more like okay, is there something that you believe like that is not not in the mainstream, where you think like most of the people are maybe misled in some way? But like
okay. I mean, look, I think the thing that I'm a big proponent of that I don't think is really mainstream is this is in line with the idea of mental health is the clinical value of psychedelics. So like we don't leverage psychedelics enough, in my opinion, and especially as like, I mean, we've talked a lot about like self-actualization, purpose, and fulfillment. I don't think these are like magic therapeutics. I just think that they are also like tools in our toolbox, right? That we because they carry stigma with them, especially in the U.S. We don't leverage them enough, but 100%, I think that's something that we should be using in our armamentarium as something that we're working with our patients.
Yeah. I'm very glad that this starts to get some traction. It starts to be used for like PTSD a lot, and
exactly.
You say you also work with psychedelic with the patients, or are you? Yeah.
Well, so in the U.S., ketamine obviously is legal. So I'll refer patients for ketamine therapy. I know, and I have several patients who they microdose with psilocybin, larger doses with that. They do. Oh hell! I have patients who do like microdosing LSD. I have some who do they'll routinely do ayahuasca retreats. So others who do Bufo medicine. Ayahuasca is interesting because the retreats themselves are actually also like meditation retreats, right? So is the value coming from like 8 hours of meditation, or is it coming from the ayahuasca? I think there's probably both, to be honest with you. But all this to say that there's clinical value that we have to just look past the stigma and start to incorporate that therapeutically into our regimen.
Yeah. What advice would you give a young, driven individual that is exploring the longevity field and that really wants to make an impact?
Wants to make an impact as a patient, or as as a thought leader or contributor? Like, give me a little more. Tell me more about this German individual.
Not as a patient. Again?
Tell me more about this German individual. Is this like in the context of like a thought leader, or like what are the goals here?
In the context of improving human health, improving, like making an impact in the longevity field, not as a patient for himself or herself, but bringing the field forward. That wants to make an impact.
Man, I think you're doing it. Honestly, I think this, like a podcast like this, where you can have the Well, I know, not you, some other German individual.
It's not
yeah.
I really think this is a valuable question, but of course, I will also get inspired by your answer. Yes.
Yes. No, look, I think creating a forum like this is, I'm not sure why there's a little bubble there. I think creating a forum like this is great, right? Like the reality is, as I said, right, there is a plethora of information that's out there. It's actually like information overload, and a lot of it's actually not good information, right? So the layperson who's trying to navigate this and trying to like sift through and understand like, well, what's good for me? Because today I read this article that says, coffee extends my life. Tomorrow I've seen an article that coffee causes heart attacks. Like it's, like, how do you make sense of all these things? So creating a platform like this where you can actually have these conversations and you can do it in a way that's accessible to the layperson, I think pushes the boundaries of the field entirely, right? Like what we lack is, we as like medical community overall, I think, by and large, and they exist, but not to the extent that frankly they should, is, we need to have platforms that take away this asymmetry of information, right? So what I mean by that is like people in the academic space and the medical space, like we have the power of jargon. We can hide behind very big words and bullshit to, to make ourselves sound smart and not distill things down to the layperson who is not scientifically trained and doesn't have a rigorous background. And, that asymmetry is not helpful, right? Like we need to level the playing field. And I'm a big believer that if you can't explain something that's like this up here, you can't explain it in this level, you probably don't understand it yourself. Right. So, and having a forum like this is a good way to share that information with the masses in a way that's digestible and accessible. So I think that's the biggest thing. Like there's going to be great and more research coming out, right? How do you translate that? How do you have these like tough conversations around like, should we even thinking about radical longevity? Should we be thinking about something else? Is this a stepwise progression? What comes first if it is stepwise? Why does it come first? These are the tougher questions that we should be asking ourselves as a community focused on longevity and performance health and wellness. That I think that a forum like this does it. So I love this, and I think that the other thing I would say is the two things I would say is this is a field in rapid evolution, and as a result, there's two things you need to do. You need to accept the fact that things change. Like there are no sacred cows, right? And so that's like what you learn today may not be valid in 6 months. And the burden is on us to find that information, those valuable resources, right? Like the sources that are agnostic, but honest, right? Like we don't want people selling us shit. We want people giving us like good raw data and good inferences and insights from that data. And again, you had Andrea on the podcast. I think I saw a few weeks ago. Her institute is doing great work, and I can't espouse the benefit of that enough. It's those resources like that I think are hugely beneficial.
Yeah. If you could go back and give advice to your younger self, like maybe 10, 15 years ago, what would you advise yourself?
Man, I don't think I have enough time to tell myself all the things that I should have not done or should have done in the subsequent 15 years. I think if I had to, distill it down to this is, I would tell myself at that time to be more present in the moment. And so, and this is like a very, I'll spare you like all the context, but for the short answer is that, we tend to get caught up and think that like this decision in front of us is like the decision, right? And it's generally never the case that it's like, that's like that impactful, or we tend to like always kind of, catastrophize or think about the future state. And a lot of times we defer gratification. That's like the name of the game for every doctor, right? Like you spend 10 years in training. So like you lose your 20s. And that, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. There's definitely, value and a role for that. But being present in those moments and appreciating those moments, right? Like it gets back to this idea of fulfillment, like even the shit moments, even those tough moments, like that's where growth happens, is like through those painful moments. So, appreciating those moments for all that they are, actually, I think leads to a more fulfilled life. And I think actually, this is anecdotal, but I think the perspective with which you engage in those moments actually will impact your physiology by lowering your cortisol levels, and then not triggering these like inflammatory cascades, right? So I think appreciating the moments for all that they are, good and bad, is probably the singular advice I would give my 15-year-old self, or whatever, 15 years ago self. But I know that guy, he's not going to listen. He's not, that guy thought he already knew it all, so he's not going to listen.
I deeply agree. Like, be conscious, even in the shit moments, experience them fully. Okay. Thank you, Rafid. Is there any last thing you want to share with people before we end this conversation?
No, yes, I really enjoyed it. I hope I didn't bore your future listeners with this. So if anyone made it this far into the conversation, I appreciate their patience. And any questions around Cenegenics, around longevity, performance health, our website is cenegenics.com, Cenegenics. And I'm on, Rafid Fadul at, I think, Instagram, and I think I have a TikTok. I should probably know this better. But Rafid Fadul, I think there's only one of me out there, so you can probably find me.
Thank you very much. So this was my conversation with Rafid Fadul. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Here, you can find a video of me interviewing Charles Maddox, the producer of the Reversed Longevity documentary that Rafid was part of. If you're not watching this on YouTube, I put a link into the description, and also links to everything else that I mentioned. Down there, you'll also find a link to Zala City. It's the pop-up city that I'm staying at currently. It's in the middle of Berlin, and it's like a place where people that want to work on aging, that want to work on extending human health span, come together, and we live together here for 6 weeks. Bye-bye.